Good afternoon. My name is Tom Beaker, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, which is held here in room 303 on the third floor of the City County Building on the third Thursday of every month. A detailed schedule of this series, as well as information about Historical Society activities and programs, can be found at our website, www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television and on our YouTube website. Our speaker today is Gail Blankenau, from here in Lincoln. Gail is an accomplished genealogist and experienced photo historian. With her interest in homesteading in Nebraska and homesteading in general, her talk today will discuss 3 women homesteaders who are that had homesteads here in Nebraska. Gail.
Thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you, my fellow Nebraskans and my fellow history buffs, for being here today to find out a little bit more about these remarkable women who came out west and realized their dream of owning land in their own name. The 1862 Homestead Act was an act to secure homesteads to actual settlers on the public domain. And that phrase, actual settlers, meant a lot to our Congress at that time. We'd had a whole host of land acts in the past. And guess what happened? Land speculation. So they were very specific that they wanted this to be a true settling of the public domain. Not surprisingly, this Homestead Act was passed during the Civil War. The Democrats in Congress at the time had been very much against this Land Act. When they seceded from the Union, the Republicans acted very quickly to pass the Homestead Act so that we could start to settle the lands of the public domain. Also, during the Civil War, they needed the money. They wanted to have communities that were productive, not only productive farms, but frankly, producing taxes. So they had a great deal of incentive to open it up to all sorts of people. One of the reasons this particular Land Act was a radical act in its day is because it opened up land ownership to people who had hitherto been kind of on the margins of our society. Because as you look at the act itself, it was any person who was over 21, ahead of a family. They didn't talk about gender, they didn't talk about race. It was open to U.S. citizens or to people who had the intent to become such, and they had to file their declaration of intention to become a U.S. citizen. They had to be, of course, the head of the household. Also, they said, we want you to come and you have to settle for at least 5 years. This was to try to prevent that land speculation. It's no surprise that thousands of women answered the call because this was a unique opportunity for women to start over and have land in their own name. How many women were homesteaders? Well, guess what? We don't know exactly. The National Park Service, they say about 25%. But remember, this is going from January 1863 all through the 1970s when the last homestead was applied for in Alaska. That's probably right for that long time period, but not surprisingly, in the earliest years that we'll be talking about today, I think the number's going to be closer to what it was in North Dakota, 12%. And the earlier, I think that's going to creep up in every successive year. So what kinds of women came out to homestead in places like Nebraska? We had a lot of widows. In fact, probably widows are the greatest percentage of women who came out. Single women, divorced women, deserted women, or women who could prove that their husbands weren't capable. Either they had a physical or mental disability that made the woman the head of the household. So you can see only married women were the women who could not homestead on their own. Regardless of gender, homesteaders faced many challenges. And they were the same for everyone. And it was a great equalizer. First, not only did they have to come and settle, they had to improve. And that meant they had to have a dwelling, and that dwelling had to have a certain minimum size. They also had to meet that minimum size, and that's why we find out how large our homesteaders' houses were and what they were made of in these unique files. The earliest people, of course, naturally chose land by creeks and rivers. But those who came after had to dig a well. And even the ones who were by creeks and rivers eventually dug a well. But you can imagine how critical it was for them to get a good start on their farm project. You know, the whole thing is people say, free land, but you're going to find out they paid a price. I mean, there's nothing that's really free. And they talk about blood, sweat, and tears, but also it costs money to dig a well. It costs money to feed your horse or your oxen. So it was freer than most land, but they still had to make a tremendous investment. You had to cultivate the ground. Now, throughout time, the Homestead Act had to be tweaked a little bit because we Nebraskans know the farther west you go, the harder it is to make a living farming in what's clearly grazing land. And we had to make some adjustments. Weather. Weather is a big one, and it's still a big one today, isn't it? This is one of the things that we really can't control, no matter what people say. And there were insects. So we have people out here facing hailstorms, tornadoes, drought, and they don't have electricity, and they have to deal with things as they come. One of the worst locust infestations in the history of the United States took place in Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, the whole Great Plains region in 1874, smack dab in the middle of homesteading time for Nebraskans. Where do you find these records? For many years, they've been housed at the National Archives. And you could go into the National Archives and get the original papers signed by the person you're interested in and look at it and photograph it or photocopy it. Today, they're still housed at the National Archives, but Fold 3 has all of Nebraska's homestead files, completed homestead land case entry files, digitized. And they're going to do the entire country, state by state. It's a tremendous opportunity for all of us to learn more about the homesteading time. The more we digitize these records, the more we can quantify some things and answer some questions that we still have about this very important time period in our history. I would also invite you, if you are anywhere near the county where your ancestor or the family you're interested in homesteaded, the county level will have the patent books, and they'll also have tract books. And why I like tract books is, although we like this whole individualism, and there were rugged individuals who came out here, homesteading was often a family affair or a group affair. People came in groups, settled as close together as possible as they could so they could help one another out. So this was truly a community project. The tract book will show for a certain township and range who's by the people you're interested in. And you're going to find a lot of times there are going to be people who are very significant, all living together as close as they can. A lot of people don't realize that the website at the Nebraska State Library and Archives, has a federal tract book index. So you can plug in, you may not know if your ancestor was a homesteader or not. You can plug in a name and see if they come up in this federal tract book. Now, I want to make sure it's not just homesteads on here. There'll be preemptions and other federal, any federal land is going to show up in this index. But when you go to the actual tract book, it'll tell you whether it was a homestead or a cash entry or a preemption or how your ancestor acquired that land and whether they finished the process. One little known fact is only 40% of the people who started this process proved up and ended the process. This was not for the faint of heart. This was hard work, and the success rate overall was about 40%. And that's throughout time. Here's an example of a tract book. I won't spend a lot of time on it because I want to talk about the women. But you can see in that one margin, it says home on most of these. And this was in Dodge County. And I was looking at the Johnson family. And look how they settled together. And people leveraged the different acts. She did a cash entry, everybody else did homesteads, and then someone else right in the next township did a railroad land purchase. So the family went together, and they were poor people from Ireland, and they ended up with a lot of land in Dodge County, Nebraska, by leveraging all the different land acts. What kinds of information do you find in these unique records? A tremendous amount, way more than we find in other kinds of land records. At the beginning, a person had to apply, and they had to apply and do an affidavit saying, yes, I'm over 21, yes, I'm a head of family, that I meet all the requirements. Then they entered into that period where they had to make all those improvements that we talked about. At the end, they did it again. They have an affidavit saying, I cultivated this many acres, here is what I built, and then you had to have witnesses saying, yes, she did all of these things. Later on, early on, they didn't do so much the newspaper notice, but throughout most of this time period, there was a newspaper notice. They had to run it for 5 weeks in advance because if there was an objection to this, they had to have the legal right to object. Later ones have Q&A, questions and answers, and this elicited even more information about how these women did it. If any special circumstances came up, and unfortunately we have to almost wish something special happened, you'll have a long narrative explaining why something didn't happen or something did happen, and any changes that might have to be made so they could end the process and prove up and receive their land. Widows whose husbands made the initial entry still had the right to finish that homestead. So she could start the process, her husband dies, they provide the death date, and they can finish the process and have the land in their name. So we often find this kind of information. Many of the widows and single women, they were considered pretty eligible, let's say. And actually, most of the ones that I've looked at for women, they did marry during the process. Many of these widows married, and many of the single women were married by the end of the process. Not always, but again, majority. So you might find the date of her remarriage, and of course, her new name. Civil War widows, they had a little bit of a special deal, as did Civil War veterans. If you were a Civil War widow and you were 19 and you were the head of family, you didn't have to be 21 to be eligible. And you could apply your husband's service, when he died in the service, to the continuous residence. So if he fought for a year, you only had to have the 4 years of continuous residence. So that was something to try to help these poor widows and many times the minor heirs to make it through this terrible time. In the case of John Jolly, who had been in the Indiana Infantry, his widow Matilda came out here and homesteaded in Nebraska. And not only did we find out all about his service, all of his wounds and how he died, we also found the entire family's birth records at a time when Nebraska wasn't keeping vital records, because the children also had the right to a pension due to his length of service and how he died. More importantly, we find out how they did it, how they farmed. In this example, we have Elizabeth Welsh, and her final proof. She has to make that affidavit and say the improvements she made and how she did it. She had a frame house, 16 by 24. You're going to see a lot of 16 by 24 houses, by the way, with a brick basement and 1.5 stories high, which is pretty nice because most of them were 1 story. They always mention whether they have doors or windows. And they also, at this time period, earlier they didn't have to give the value. She says she thinks these improvements are worth $500, which back then was a pretty big improvement on virgin prairie land. She had 50 chickens, so let's start to think about what she might have been doing to pay someone to help her with her, maybe digging the well. I think we had a lot of women were working really hard for other people, cooking, sewing, doing laundry, getting egg money, whatever they could do to succeed. They had to be fantastic managers to make it all work. And this woman says, I have no farm implements at the present, and she's farming by shares. So we see how Elizabeth was doing it. She was doing a lot of work on the side, and she was farming by shares. She also had 2 dish safes. What does that tell us? Most people in these little dwellings didn't have 2 stoves and 2 dish safes. She was cooking. There were men out there batching it. I bet she was a popular stop for them. If they were single or widowed, widows are single again, they had to be naturalized if they were not born in this country. And so you will often find naturalization records in the homestead file. They're also kept separately at the county or district court where they were naturalized, but you will get copies of their naturalization from these files. This woman, she is Jane Agnes Caudry, and she was from Great Britain and Ireland. She was particularly from Great Britain, and she's saying that I disavow my allegiance to Queen Victoria. Now, the Caudrys, I won't get into them too much because I have 3 important case studies, but this is a great example of an entire family that came over and homesteaded as close together as they could get, the brothers and the sisters. And all the sisters, except one, remained single during the process, and one did get married during the process. Most of you who are here, you're here because you're interested in this, and you probably already know that the first acknowledged homesteader is Daniel Freeman of Beatrice, Nebraska, which is why Nebraska is so privileged to have our wonderful National Homestead Monument Park down near Beatrice. I love that place. I took this picture myself. Which brings us to the first woman homesteader, Mary Myers. She made her homestead, she made her application days, just days after Daniel Freeman made his, and everyone's probably heard the somewhat apocryphal story about Daniel Freeman getting leave and getting them to open the land office just for him so he could get there and then get back to his regiment. Well, not long after, Mary Myers was at that land office making her application. She was born in 1813 in the village of Mühlenbach, Germany, in the state of Baden. Here's a photo of that area right now. Can you imagine what Mary was thinking when she arrived in Gage County? We have a fairly forested, very large hills with vineyards up and down the hills. And in fact, she and her husband, Philip Myers, were Rebmann, which were vine dressers. Meant that she was basically a field worker, and so was her husband. And that's what they did. They worked in these vineyards for other people. They had no hope of ever owning their own land. When I found out where she was from, I had to look at the German church record. And Mühlenbach was so small that they went to a Catholic church in the neighboring slightly larger village of Eisenthal. And I got the church record, and I apologize, it's in Germanic script, and it's hard to read. But what I want to bring your attention to is on the right of the screen, all of those are death dates. So Mary was the second wife of Philip Myers, which is why we start with number 2. And she had 11 children, and out of 11 children, 8 of them died young. So Philip and Mary were no stranger. They were no strangers to hardship when they came to the United States. The route they took. I found this great map, and it was produced for German immigrants. And this is at the Library of Congress. You can go to Library of Congress and put in the search engine this map. And they came in 1855, and this is an 1853 map. So it's very likely they were looking at this map or one very similar to it. Muhlenbach was on the Rhine River as well. So we can pretty much guess that they went down the Rhine River up to Rotterdam, and then they took the boat from Rotterdam to New York. This same map gives us the main routes once they arrive to get to their final destination. And my research revealed that their first destination was Wisconsin. So I looked at New York, Nach is to Chicago, or Milwaukee, and they ended up in Milwaukee, and then they kind of acclimated to our way of life within the German communities that were very large at that spot at that time. How do I know they got here in 1855? Well, I couldn't find them on any ships lists. And of course, Myers is a common name, and I did lots of different spellings, but I tried all of my tricks and they didn't work. I wrote to the Baden archives and I said, I'm looking for Philip and Mary Myers, and I understand that he had to apply to immigrate. Germans didn't have freedom of movement, even within Germany. If they left Baden and went to a different German state, they had to get permission from the local department. And so Philip did apply in 1855 to immigrate. However, she told me I have 24 pages here where he was never given permission to immigrate because he had creditors. And yet, so never given permission, and yet by 1855, daughter Teresa married in July of 1855 in Wisconsin. So I know very closely when they came. And so I think the reason I'm not finding their ships list is because they went under a different name. I like this part of the map because you can see, where's Nebraska? It says Indian Territory. So I can be pretty sure looking at this map that this was not on the Myers family radar screen when they started, but it certainly got to be on their radar screen once they got on the ground. As soon as that secession happened, people started talking about this Homestead Act, and people talked and said, there's going to be free land out there. So people came in droves from Wisconsin through Iowa, if that's where they were living, and from the south up through Missouri. However they got here, they came here to Homestead. And there's a close-up just showing how in 1853, Nebraska's just Indian Territory. We have Missouri, we have Iowa, Illinois looks pretty good, pretty settled, but you can see how little information really they had about what they were getting into. By 1860, the Myers family was in Nebraska, and we have the Nebraska Territorial Census, and there they are. And there's Mary with her husband Philip, and you can see that the daughter Teresa, who married Joseph Graff in Wisconsin, is living right next door. They're already on the land that they're going to homestead, and the Homestead Act wasn't passed until 1862. So basically, they were squatting there in order to get the best land, and they did get really good land. There's a family Bible still in the family's possession, and it shows that Philip was born the 8th of May, 1808, and he died on the 27th of September in 1861. So just a year after that territorial census was taken, he dies. So Mary's here. She has one grown daughter who's married, and she has had another child named Herman in Wisconsin, her last child. And he did live to adulthood, thank goodness for her. So here she is with a couple of small children, alone, but she's going to follow the plan. She makes her application just a little bit after Daniel Freeman at the Brownville Land Office on the 20th of January, 1863. And as you can see, the application mainly just says, here we are, this is the application, here's the land description. I want to point out a very important thing that you want to note when you look at these things. Mary Meyer, not surprisingly, signed by Mark, and historians generally use that to judge whether someone was literate or not. So we have a woman who's an immigrant signing by Mark with the American dream. Her affidavit simply says what we already talked about, that she's a widow, she's the head of family, she's over 21, she's never given aid or comfort to the enemy. That was another important thing that you had to establish. In other words, Confederates need not apply, nor people who gave them aid or comfort, which means they're widows if they ever aided and comforted their husbands, which one would presume they did. They couldn't, even once they were widowed, be a homesteader. 5 years later to the day, which is not the usual, to the day, Mary goes back to the Brownville office and proves up her claim. Daniel Freeman is certificate number 1 in Gage County, and she is certificate number 3. So she's very significant. She's so early on the ground, it's almost incredible. I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of records, and she's just an amazing woman to me. Her witnesses were none other than Daniel Freeman and her son-in-law, Joseph Groff. And again, they're just doing the affidavit saying she has been here for 5 years, she's done all of the improvements, she's fulfilled what she needed to fulfill. What I really love about this one is, again, we have this 16 by 24. She has a 16 by 26 foot, one-story house, and it has a shingle roof. This is big. Board floors, 3 doors, 4 windows, but this is what I love most. It's a comfortable place to live in. Not all of them say that. And can you imagine this whole dwelling is the size of a lot of people's nice family rooms. And you've got all these people going in and out and cooking and sleeping all in this space. But for her, it was a comfortable place to live in. They also had a corral, a corn crib, chicken coop. They dug a well, set out fruit trees, and not surprisingly, grapevines. Now, grapevines are actually fairly common. You don't have to have been from Baden to have grapevines. But I think Mary probably knew quite a bit about how to leverage the grapevines. And you see the original signatures of Daniel Freeman and Joseph Groff. But even better, during this 5-year period when they were digging wells and building chicken coops and watching children and doing all this hard work, she learned to sign her name. And it's a German script. I do a lot of German genealogy. This is German script. Some Germanic person, probably one of her children, taught her how to write her name during this time period. And I like to think it was just in preparation for this moment. Don't you think? This had to be a big moment for her. No hope in Germany of ever owning her own land, and here she is. She's got prime farm ground in Nebraska. Again, her certificate. And I always look, does everything match up? Whenever I look at any document, I look from page to page to page, and I found a few discrepancies. And then we want to look in other places to see if we can resolve them. Joseph Groff says that she was there on the 1st of January, not the 20th. Well, they were squatting, so I'm pretty sure she was there before the 1st of January. But we also have a 16 by 18 dwelling there when she did her application, because this is 1863. And so I pulled Joseph Graff's to see what he said about his. And in fact, lucky for us, he made a little mistake, and his dwelling straddled a boundary, and so he had to explain how they built all their dwellings before they applied. So this is probably right. It's not a mistake. She probably had this dwelling and added on to it during the 5 years. So you want to pull, that's why I like the tract books. I like to pull the neighbors and see what are they doing, what explanations are they giving. And you can find out a little bit about the whole neighborhood and see how it all worked out. So this file, without even looking at all the other things that I looked at, gave me quite a bit of information about her. And then I went out to the census and church records and all sorts of other records to fill in some of the blanks. We can also look at newspapers. How many are you from small towns? I'm from a small town. My paper was so newsy, almost more newsy than you wanted at times. But they would tell you a lot about things that were happening with your family and with the neighbors. And really, you want to, once you have established them on the ground in a certain place, you want to look at the newspapers that are still in existence. Which brings us to the Chrisman sisters. Now, this is a fairly famous photograph. And the reason they're famous is all 4 daughters of this family were homesteaders. And you can see we have Harriet, Elizabeth, Lucy, and Ruth. And her full name was Jenny Ruth. Out of these 4 women, 3 of them married during the process, and it was the 3 oldest girls. And they all got married, and so their patents are in their married name. Just one, Jenny Ruth, remained single. So we talked about a widow. I want to talk about a single woman who went out into a different part of Nebraska at a different time period and made it all work. When she made her application, she made her application so she would be near her family members. And this was not uncommon for men either. So don't think that, oh, women were only, using other people. Always, this was a community group project. Regardless of gender, people wanted to be together so they could help one another out. And she talks about being a native-born citizen. And now because we have Q&A, we have a little more information than what we saw in Mary Meyer's application and proof. She was born in Missouri. We have her age. We have the usual thing of the land description. But we also see that at the bottom, she's been absent temporarily, but not to exceed 2 months. Well, obviously 2 months was one of those provisions later on that they said if you exceed 2 months, you're not in continuous residence. She took in sewing. She did all sorts of things because, as she explains at the bottom, I had to make a living. So she wasn't able to make a living on her homestead at this time period. She also talks about its grazing land, and I have a little bit of hay land. So my cultivated acres are smaller than maybe what you would want, but you understand this is Custer County, Nebraska. So you get kind of the context of in which she was having to make a go of it. I picked the closest census before her patent. The 1890 census was burned in a fire. So 1885, Nebraska had a state census, and we find the Chrisman family, and you see Jenny Ruth is the youngest. She's only 13 at the time. And you can see the other girls. Elizabeth was 27, Lucy was 19, a brother, Eugene, 11, Hattie or Harriet, 15. You see that there's a brother, Marcus, living below. He's age 23, and he's considered to have his own household, although he's living in the same house. So we have Joseph and all of these Chrismans here by 1885. The Chrisman parents were both born in Virginia, and all of the children were born in Missouri. So that's what we learn about the family. Kind of gives us some context and should prompt some questions. Ruth made money as a teacher. We're very privileged to have quite a bit of information about Ruth. She was interviewed extensively. The Nebraska Historical Society exchanged letters with people who knew her. They even exchanged letters with her. And she said, well, I don't know that anybody would be interested in this. So, and of course, we're all very interested in what she did. So all of her brothers and sisters had done homesteading, and that was her plan as well, but she needed to get some money because she was going to need to make those improvements. She taught before she homesteaded. And this put her into the blizzard of 1888. And many of you are nodding because you know that this is also known as the school children's blizzard. And here she is teaching school. She had 13 students that day, and she noticed her horse getting really upset. And so she went out to check on the horse, and when she went out, she thought, oh my, the wind has changed, the temperature has dropped, and I'm pretty sure we're going to have a blizzard. She hurries back in right away and starts right away saying, we're getting our coats on and we're going to leave because otherwise we'll be trapped here. I have no fuel left. We have to get out. What did she do? We know so many school children died in this blizzard because they were on their way home, and a lot of them didn't have the proper clothing because it was a pretty nice day when it started. We have all had those days, haven't we? Oh, this was a nice day when it started. She had her horse Daisy, who was the first one who kind of gave her the clue. So she hung on to Daisy, and she said wherever Daisy wanted to go was where we were going to go. So they all held on to one another in a human chain with Daisy at the lead. And Daisy took them away from the closest place because it was into the wind. She turned her back to the wind and went about 3 miles to the next closest place. And they all lived. Now, they were running out of fuel after the 3 days that they were trapped there, but they had food. They were hungry, but they had food and they had fuel, and they all lived. And it was because her father always told her, trust your horse. And this is Daisy, by the way, in the photograph. Good old Daisy. I love horses, so I love Daisy. Here's another photograph of the Chrisman Ranch, one of the Chrisman ranches, because remember, they all homesteaded. And you can see it's not there? Oh no, you don't have the Chrisman Ranch. Don't know what to do. Well, I will tell you that it's this great picture, and you're welcome to come up afterwards and look at it. There are cattle, and you can see the canyons and the roughness. And at the bottom, you can see a woman riding side saddle. And all the other men are on their horses. So I'd like to think that was Jenny, but I can't tell because she's too far away. So what did we learn about her? She's single, born in Missouri, 27. We get a lot of information about her. She talks about the land and how she made it, and she talked about taking and sewing. And when she went into town and would sew for 6 weeks for various families, and they would get their, new coat or whatever they needed, and then she'd go on to the next place and then go back to the homestead. She had 4 witnesses. We needed more witnesses as time went on. And all of this was in the Custer County Republican. I always like to know what newspaper should I be looking at. Here are the Chrisman hits that if you went to fold 3, you'll notice that her sisters aren't in there because I want you to know that they're indexed under the name the patent was granted. So because the other sisters married, you have to know the married name and then search for them that way. So Jenny's the only one, but you also see the boys. A good historian not only looks at what's there, but they look at what isn't there. And what wasn't there to me was the father Joseph, who was still alive during this time. Why did he not homestead? Well, remember, I had collected the census data as well. And remember, Joseph was born in Virginia, and the children were all born in Missouri. My theory, which turned out to be true, was that he was a Confederate. So all the children homesteaded in Nebraska in the Custer County area, but he did not because he was a Confederate. So always ask more questions, what's there and what isn't there, and you'll complete the picture a little bit more. Last but not least, we have a woman deserted, Margaret W. Fawcett. Their entry was made by her husband, Simeon Fawcett, in May of 1870. And you can see that he was at the Beatrice land office at this time. The 1870 census, they were already there, And there's Simeon, and you get a nice picture of the family group as it was in 1870, with Margaret and her husband being from Ohio, all the children from Iowa. So unlike the Myers family that just kind of passed through Iowa on their way here, we have this family living in Iowa for quite a while before they made the leap over the Missouri River to start a new life in Nebraska. Margaret was the one who made the affidavit almost 7 years later. So what's happening here? She says she's the wife of Simeon. He made the entry, but that now she is the head of the family. She has 4 children still at home. She's a native-born citizen, and she started this project with Simeon. But my said husband, Simeon Fawcett, who made the aforesaid homestead entry, has been dead, as I verily believe, for the last 2 years and 5 months, because he disappeared. If you do a little math, which you always do when you see those things, she's saying that he left approximately December of 1874. Now, I don't know if you remember that slide that I showed at the beginning about insects, but that locust infestation was in 1874, and it hit Nebraska hard. Every homesteader that was still in the process at that point lost their crops. And not long after, he gets on his horse, not to be seen. We get a lot of information because we have a special circumstance. He saddled his horse, left, no one heard anything of him. My 6 sons, so some of the sons weren't in that census with her, so we learn a little bit more. They all made inquiries, but no one's heard anything from him. She also relates that my said husband was subject to insane spells, and it was during one of these that he left. And again, that got me to thinking, was Simeon a Civil War veteran as well? And indeed, he was. Now, we'll never know because we don't have a doctor saying, yes, he had post-traumatic stress syndrome. We didn't even know about it back then. But I do wonder if she's telling the truth here, if he wasn't suffering from that, and then that locust infestation just kind of sent him over the brink. He was done. So here she is. She's got some older children who can help her, but here she is by herself having to finish what they had started. And hope, against hope, that they would take her entry. She, like everyone else, has to say what her improvements were. So remember Mary Myers, she had her comfortable house with the board floors and the windows. And then we had a sod house for Jenny Ruth Chrisman. And now we have a stone house. So where you homesteaded in Nebraska really mattered, because there were stones in that area, and a lot of people were bringing stones up from the Missouri area to complete some of these stone homes and barns. Hers is 16 by 28. It's 1 story high, nearly completed. It's been her exclusive home. She said she was an actual settler. Remember, that actual settlement was important. She had 30 acres cultivated. She also had a stone stable. Now, that was hard work. That was hard work. And she gives all of that information, and that she has 2 outside cellars or caves also of stone. So they've done a lot of improvements in the 7 years since they made their entry. What did she grow? She had 300 fruit trees and 400 forest trees, and she has 3 acres in strawberries, raspberries, grapes, and currants. Not always the kind of thing that I see. So I'm thinking she's putting up preserves and selling preserves in order to help pay for some of the improvements that they've had to finish since her husband left. But remember, she's asserting, I'm a widow, because she knows widows get their entry, right? And you also see her beautiful handwriting, Margaret W. Fawcett. Her witnesses were 2 of her younger sons who were still there. So we learned quite a bit about her, but of course we need to go outside. But see how much more we get when there's a special circumstance. You know, the husband with the insane spells and all these things. I know that they're her sons now, but we can't know for sure that they're her sons until we check. But from that document, that's what we got. You might be asking, why 7 years after the initial entry? Remember, grasshoppers. We had special provisions for people who did lose their crops, and they had 7 years. Simeon made his entry in May of 1870. She made her entry in April of 77. She waited till the last possible minute, probably hoping that he would return and she wouldn't have to take the risk of losing everything. But she couldn't let it go by another month. She had to make her entry and hope that the court would grant it. I can't imagine how she felt going in there. Was she successful? Yes. But they didn't buy that she was a widow. It's granted on the outside of the packet. I actually went down and looked at some of this down at the courthouse. It said the deserted wife of Simeon Fawcett gets this patent. She was the head of the household. That's all she had to prove, but I think she was a little nervous about that. By 1880, well, the lost is found, because now she's listed as divorced. So, of course, I couldn't leave that alone, so I had to drive down to Fairbury to the Jefferson County, Nebraska courthouse, which I did in the summer of 2013. Beautiful day, beautiful place, loved it. And in the General District Court Index on the docket, I found Margaret Fawcett versus Simeon Fawcett, February 17th, 1880. And this was full of more information. That she was married to him in Belmont County, Ohio on the 31st of December, 1844, and they came in March of 1870. So we know exactly when they got here. That he left her, and she says November 74, before it was 2 years and 5 months. So I was about right. I had December. It was November of 74, she's now saying. And this was before no-fault divorce, people. So she says, I was always kind and affectionate toward him. And that she had, in all respects, been true to her marriage vows. He's, of course, not present to answer any of this, but I do think that he was probably a bit of a rotter. She has since learned that he is cohabiting with a woman unknown to the petitioner, and he's still cohabiting with her in a state of adultery. So that's a little more detail than sometimes we want to find, but I had to go find it. Once the question's there, I had to go look. So what happened to good old Simeon? He went in and out of the old soldier's home in Iowa. He went back to Iowa, where apparently he was cohabiting with someone. And we see that one of the sons was nearby in Jasper County, Iowa, and that he was suffering from disabilities due to gunshots in the shoulder and a partial loss of his eyesight. It doesn't mention insane spells, so I don't know, but I do think she probably was telling the truth, that he was just completely stressed out by the conditions. To see everything you worked for go up in a day must have been very hard. I'm still not as sympathetic to him as I am to Margaret, however. I called the old soldier's home, and they gave me permission to use this. This is where he lived a good part of his life, especially in the 1890s. And their database didn't have him dying there. So when I talked to them, I said, well, do you know where he died? I mean, did you have to keep records like that? And they checked their records, and he did die there. They just had a mistake in their database, which has now been corrected. The reason I have these pictures, too, I want to tell you very quickly. I contacted a descendant of Margaret Fawcett, and I said, do you have any photographs? I'm going to do this Women Homesteaders thing, and I'd love to have photographs. It's a lot more interesting. And she said, I had no idea Margaret was a homesteader. I didn't even look. I looked for Simeon, but I didn't look for Margaret. So that's a lesson to us all. You know, keep open-minded. This brought people, African Americans, people on the margins of society, could realize the American dream. Margaret was last seen in 1885 in Furnace County. What is her son doing? She's living right by him. He's homesteading again. She's sold her homestead. They've gone west, and they're starting over again. She does say she's a widow, though, even though she's divorced. So when you go to a new place, you can really start over. Can't do that anymore, can we? This has been Tumbleweeds in the Window, and I hope that these women's stories have inspired you as much as they inspired me. We went from sod houses to stone houses to the comfortable board house to live in. And you're probably wondering why I said tumbleweeds in the window. Very quickly, I'll tell you, that's the image that I always use when I look at these records, because another account of another woman said, we were so poor we couldn't afford windows in our soddy, and we didn't have enough paper to paper over the windows, and the dirt and the dust and the wind and especially the insects were terrible. So we looked around and we saw these tumbleweeds, and these are immigrants from Schleswig-Holstein. And we thought, well, why don't we put those in the window? And she said, you know, it really helped. I like to think that when we learn from history, we become better people ourselves. And I'd like to think that I'm not going to have the challenges that they have, but I can use my own metaphorical way of picking up a tumbleweed, something that seems useless to other people, and use courage and ingenuity and grit to solve my challenges and put my own tumbleweed in my window. Thank you so much for your time. I think we have a few moments for questions, and thank you for holding your questions. I wanted to make sure that everyone here, if you had to rush off back to work, that you didn't miss anything. Yes?
None of the houses were the same size. Was there a blueprint that a homesteader might, you know,
Oh, that's an excellent question. It depended on the place and time. There were some blueprints. There was a package deal, and you see it especially in the Dakotas. They homesteaded a little bit later in general, though there were some that were up there in the 1860s as well. But the larger numbers arrived later. So yes, they did. And sometimes they would take the old homestead and truck it over to the next person after they were done, and they would reuse some of these dwellings. And some of them are, oh, I tell you, they are sad to look at. These three women actually probably did have relatively comfortable places to live in compared to some. But there was a minimum, 16 by 20 that they kind of had to have in the 5 years. They had the whole 5 years to make it that size, but you can notice that a lot of them added on and were a little bit bigger, but not a lot bigger than that. They had a lot of other improvements to make as well. But yes, sometimes they did use a blueprint. And a lot of the log cabins around Beatrice were very similar to the one that they have down at the Homestead Monument. I would encourage you to go down there and go in that cabin too, because it really gives you an idea. And in fact, it's slightly larger than most of them, but only slightly. Other questions?
In that fold 3, if you have the legal description of the property, can you find out who the homestead is?
Yes, there are a lot of ways that you can search, and you can use the legal description. It is easier if you have, and then also you can put in the county in the keyword area. If, in case not everybody heard, he was asking about fold 3, searching the Nebraska homestead records, if there are different ways that you could find it. And he used land description, which is a good idea, because you may know what your land was. And if it's a woman homesteader, you may not know what name she homesteaded under. But if you live near the county, too, I would say look at the land records in the county as well, because the patent book will be there. A patent is just the first entry. You'll only patent one piece of land once. After that, buying and selling is going to be in the deed books. Other questions? I know we have at least one descendant of a woman homesteader here.
Did I misread it, or did the Myers spell their name, last name different?
Oh, you did not miss that. That was very good. they were German and they didn't read or write. In the old German record, it was Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. But when they got here, they started to use Myers. And then some of them said Meyer with a Y, and some of them said Myers with an S in the same homestead file. Our ancestors were not as hung up on spelling as we became later. We did not have standardized spelling, which is very important for historical researchers to keep in mind. People miss things because they get married to a spelling, and you can't do it. If you've read even people like Thomas Jefferson's original things, you'll see that he'll spell the same word various ways in one document. And he was very well educated for the day. Now we have spelling. Any other questions?
Where was Myers Homestead from Beatrice?
Oh, it's actually right by Daniel Freeman's. That's why he was. And Robert Graff is living on the Graff homestead, and he still owns most of Mary's homestead as well. One piece of her original homestead was sold to the Mennonite church to build a church. So just one little corner has a church in it. And it's still in the family, which is amazing. So I've actually been down there and walked. The dwelling is gone, but I've walked on the ground.
Did
Yes.
you know the homesteaders from Schleswig-Holstein that had the tumbleweeds?
I do know who they were.
Who were they? That's where Neil came from.
From near Cedar, and were they near Cedar Bluffs?
Yes.
Oh, perhaps. In fact, there's a little cemetery not far from there that has tons of people from that part of Schleswig-Holstein. And I have to tell you that there is, you'd have to Google it, I don't have the URL, but the Danish Archives has put all of their church records, they're digitized and online for free. So if you can figure out where in Denmark your family is from, and I have done that for several people, I've gotten them all sorts of information about their family out of these records, because that part was part Danish, and so they have all of these old records. And some of them are in German, and some of them are in Danish. Obviously, I don't read Danish, so I was looking at the German ones mainly for this family, and I'm trying to think, because it was years ago when I looked at this, the name of the people. It was a common name. Oh, really common, Schmidt. And his name was John. Does anybody have any creativity? They do now. But yeah, he was Johann Schmidt. But the old Nebraska marriage records, I got the wife's maiden name off of that. But I had to look at each child's because, again, they weren't quite sure. I don't know if the clerk didn't speak German or anything, but yeah, we had a lot of different permutations of her name. So thank you so much for your time. You've been a great audience, and I hope, again, that you're as inspired by these remarkable women as I am. Thank you.